All right, Andrew Jackson. I love this portrait. Whoever painted this really tried to get the kind of a wild majesty, I think, of Andrew Jackson. I mean, look at his hair. So, inevitably, Andrew Jackson is going to be compared to another president of recent times. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think I totally get it that Andrew Jackson, in some very superficial ways, brings to mind Donald Trump. I don't think it's a good comparison, but I get it. Both of them were seen as loose cannons in their time. And a lot of people were fearful when Andrew Jackson became president. But Andrew Jackson was, unlike Donald Trump, was a lot more popular amongst the population as a whole. So anyway, moving on, the bibliography. Again, we have Robert V. Rimini, Andrew Jackson, nice short biography, very well done. He was kind of the standard, as I said, the historian that most people would look to years ago as the expert on Andrew Jackson. Very informative for a short biography. Makes some very good points about his character, about the times in which they lived. So yeah, highly recommend this one. John William Ward, Andrew Jackson, Symbol for an Age. There are people who enjoy books like this. I'm not one of them. It talks about Andrew Jackson as the symbol, as the title suggests. It talks more about symbolism in American history and how he represented various types of symbols for Americans. And like I said, some historians really like this type of stuff. I'm just not one of them. So I've never been the type that delves into symbolism very much. I'm a very concrete type of person. So anyway, but if you like that sort of thing, this is a well done book. W.H. Brands. How many of you know that name? He's a wonderful author. He did Benjamin Franklin and won, I think, the Pulitzer Prize or something like that. But Andrew Jackson, his life and time, 620 pages. I could recommend just about anything by W.H. Brands. He's just so entertaining of a writer. You just enjoy what he writes. And very scholarly as well. So yeah, highly recommended. Marquise James, The Life of Andrew Jackson, 972 pages. Back in 1938. A very formal writer, kind of wordy, very detailed, not something that's fun summer reading, but not terrible either. It's not as dry as I had thought it might be. Highly informative, very, very scholarly. But not for the faint of heart. So, like I said, so it's 1938. The style of writing for historians back in those days often could be very formal, very, and on the wordy side. So, yeah, just note on that. So, early years, very rough childhood. Andrew Jackson, his father died before he was born. He's born during, or he lived during the Revolutionary War. As a young man, he wanted to help out, and he was kind of a messenger boy. He was captured, and to give you an idea of what a tough kid he was, as a young kid, when he and his brother were captured, there were some officers, British officers, saying, "Hey boy, come shine my boots now." He would not. That takes guts as a teenager to tell a British officer who has a sword in his hand, "You're going to shine my boots," and say, "No, I'm not." So he got a slash across his head, cut his hand and the side of his head for his troubles. Abused terribly. Being a prisoner was no picnic. And his mother, who was a very saintly sort of woman who tried to help Americans who were captured, prisoners of war, died of some terrible disease because of that. And so at the age of 14, Andrew Jackson is now an orphan. He married Rachel Robards, who had just separated from her husband. And so the big scandal here, of course, is not just that she's divorced and he's marrying her, but the divorce was not final and he married her. So when they found out about that, they had to get remarried. So obviously the two of them are in an adulterous relationship, which does not bode well for Victorian sensibilities. Of course, this is pre-Victorian, but anyway. So he had a plantation, the Hermitage. How many of you have visited the Hermitage? Very nice, good. It's interesting. I was out there and kind of toured the place, and one of the things that the tour guide would tell you, back in those days, there were no trees because everybody needed trees for their fireplace to heat at night. So all the trees that you see around here, you imagine back in those days, well, sure, there'd be a nice plantation, lots of beautiful trees. No trees. They're all cut down for firewood. So anyway, so he had his hermitage, had his slaves, upwards of 100, or I suppose. I understand. Then getting into his political and military career, he served in the House of Representatives, 1796. Then he was a senator, 1797, and a Superior Court judge, 1798. He hated being a legislator. He, by nature, is an administrator. He's the one who tells people what to do. He hated being amongst the legislators who sit around and argue and debate and come up with new ideas for laws just to argue and debate some more. Absolutely loathed it and did not want to do that again. So at the War of 1812, he volunteers, he gathers something like 2,000 men. So back in those days, if you could get enough volunteers to follow you, you could be an officer, and he could. So he fought against the Shawnee and other Native American tribes who were causing problems during the War of 1812. But most famously defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans, became a national hero. And I'm not going to get into the battle itself other than to say it was a close thing for a totally lopsided victory, one of the biggest in history. We killed hundreds and hundreds of British, utterly defeated them, and suffered very few deaths on our side, like a dozen or so. If the British commander could have been a better scout, he could have found a way around the defenses that were set up and could have very easily defeated the American troops, because Andrew Jackson had missed out on some of the preparations. But anyway, so now he's a national hero and wanting to be president. 1824, right around the presidential election time, his friends tell him, you need to be a senator, okay? We want you as our senator to lift your name up. And Jackson said, you know what, I really don't want to do that. I'm not a legislator. However, if you put my name up, I will not oppose it. The other thing that he did not want to do during the election of 1824, like many politicians, he did not want to state where his positions are on several different topics. If you are a senator, you have to come out and say you are in favor of this, you are opposed to that. You vote one way or another on various bills. And that's another thing he did not want to do. He had political savvy that way. But anyway, so they wanted him as senator, and he became a senator just against his will. And of course did not win the presidency at that time. So anyway, going back to the Battle of New Orleans, here's a very heroic painting of Andrew Jackson standing up in front of all these British soldiers who could easily shoot him down. But it looks good on canvas. So that's that. So the election of 1824, once again, nobody wins the requisite number of electoral votes. So it goes to the House of Representatives. And once again, we talk about the corrupt bargain. Henry Clay, who really thought that he was a shoo-in, became the fourth instead of the third in that list. And so he had to choose between John Quincy Adams or Andrew Jackson, both of whom he detested. But John Quincy Adams would appoint him as Secretary of State. And so he chose John Quincy Adams. And then we get to the election of 1828. This is a time, by the way, the 1820s was a time in which the various states were loosening up their requirements for who could vote. Many don't realize that in the beginning, in the United States, lots of people were disenfranchised in the sense that you cannot vote unless you own a certain amount of property. You had a certain amount of money. And in some states, you couldn't vote at all. It was the state representatives who chose the electoral votes. So in several of the states, for a long time, you just didn't vote for the presidency. It was your representatives in your state who did. But in the 1820s, this was coming apart. The common man was wanting the vote. And so in many states, they were dropping the property requirements. In many states, it went from the legislature to the people to vote. And so, anyway, the election of 1828 was a rout for Andrew Jackson. And I want to show you something as far as voter participation. Take a look at this. 1788, you have 43,000 people voting for George Washington. 1792, only 28,000, because who else is there to vote for? We know who's going to be president and vice president. So low turnout there. 1796, you got 66,000. 1800, 75,000. And now we're jumping up 1804, 143,000. 187, and now we're jumping up 1812, 273. Now we come to the era of good feelings. And when you feel good, you don't need to vote because everything's fine. It's when stressful times come that people want to vote. So during the era of good feelings, it drops to 111,000. And then in 1820, when once again, you know who's going to be president. What's the point? So voter participation was very low, 87,000. Now we become contentious again, 356,000. And then look at this jump from 1824 to 1828. This is when so many of the states were loosening up their requirements. You don't need to own property anymore. If you are 21 and you are a white man, you can vote. And so that's why you have this huge jump. In addition, it was an exciting time because your man, Andrew Jackson, the hero of this country, is now running for president, and you want him. You couldn't vote before, but now you can. You're an ordinary farmer. You're poor. You don't have the property that some of your neighbors may, but you can vote, and you can vote for your man, Andrew Jackson. And there was an enthusiasm there that had not happened in a long time in the United States. And so that's the core. When we talk about comparing Andrew Jackson with Donald Trump, I think the one thing that stands out, aside from they both looked like they were going to be loose cannons and you just did not know what to expect from them, they had a core support among ordinary people because of their brashness, because they could stand out and say things that others would not. They had done things that other men had not done. So that I get as far as the comparison goes. So we have, at the beginning of the administration, a totally ridiculous scandal that initially, that sometimes is presented as it was a total contrivance of the women in the administration. The Peggy Eaton affair. The Secretary of War had a wife just married before the election. She was a woman of a questionable background, shall we say. She was divorced, and she had worked as a barmaid, and so when coming into Washington society, she was less than perfect, shall we say. And so the women in the cabinet and women of society were going to shun her. But this was not originally a woman's issue. It was originally something that John C. Calhoun came up with. John C. Calhoun, the vice president, was angry that Eaton was appointed as the Secretary of War. He was wanting somebody from South Carolina. And he was jealous of what he thought was Eaton's influence to Andrew Jackson. John C. Calhoun was chomping at the bit, wanting to be president. And so he was going to undermine Eaton in the cabinet. And he used his wife to do it. So, John C. Calhoun's wife, who had an interesting name of Fluoride. No, so naturally, fluoride back in those days meant something different from toothpaste as it does today. Fluoride, from what I understand, is a mineral that has kind of a nice color to it. So that's why somebody would have the idea of naming their daughter Fluoride. Anyway, John C. Calhoun decided to tell his wife, after they had actually visited the couple. The Eatons at first were accepted, and both of them, after the wedding, had visited and had a nice visit with them. But now John C. Calhoun is up in arms and going to disrupt Jackson's cabinet, using his wife to do it. And so the ladies of society, following Fluoride's example, would shun her. And it got so bad that even the foreign emissaries, the wife of the emissary from the Netherlands, at some state dinner, found that she was going to sit next to Peggy Eaton. When she saw that, she immediately turned to her husband and said, "We are leaving. I will not sit next to that woman." So it was bad, and the Eatons were shunned in society, and it disrupted the cabinet, and it disrupted government, to the point that near the end of his first term in office, Jackson decided he needs to get rid of his entire cabinet. And so he had them resign. Now, the one man that he really wanted, Martin Van Buren, as his best advisor, he didn't want to lose Martin Van Buren, so eventually Martin Van Buren became his vice president in his second term. So here is Peggy Eaton. Now, as anybody can see in this portrait, this is not a woman of high society for Washington, D.C. What are the clues? What do you see about this portrait that would tell you immediately that this is a woman of questionable character in the 1820s? We'll look at the hair. Hair down, loose around the shoulders. The dress is off the shoulder. Yeah, obviously not someone you would want to associate with, right? Yeah, it kind of looks like it, doesn't it? I don't know. So, the other crisis in the administration, the tariff of abominations. The northern factory manufacturing interests pushed for high tariffs to protect the manufacturers of the United States. Of course, that means that in the South, when you don't have manufacturing, you have the agricultural interests, the cotton, the tobacco, who need the manufacturers. They now have to pay much higher rates for the goods that they're buying. So this was a great problem for them, and it was a great evil as they saw it, that the northern manufacturers are getting these high tariffs, and so we're subsidizing them and we're paying for it. And it's difficult for the farmers in the South, the plantations, to the point where South Carolina was talking about nullifying that law, that tariff, and saying that maybe we just shouldn't pay it. And if they're going to force us, maybe we'll just bow out. We'll secede from the Union. And so those were the grumblings of South Carolina and others in the South. Jackson, as opposed to what some people might think, he did not react immediately with anger. I remember learning about this in college many years ago, and my professor talked about how he threatened South Carolina. I'll send 50,000 troops there, and I'll get 50,000 more in the next month or two. And yes, he did send that message, and he prepared our armed forces for conflict. But he did not do it, he did it quietly though. He did not announce to the nation that I'm going to send 50,000 troops down to South Carolina. He sent it quietly, but he was also wanting to compromise. He did not want a conflict with South Carolina. He wanted to work this out. And so he sent both the carrot and the stick, and in that way saved a lot of trouble for a lot of people. He was a pretty good politician in that sense. So eventually South Carolina backed down, and they did work it out. John Calhoun resigned from the vice presidency at the end of, pretty much at the end of his term, so he could become a senator and work out that compromise. And then one of the great tragedies in our history, the Trail of Tears during Jackson's administration. This was driven more by the individual states than by Andrew Jackson, Georgia most particularly. But so, I mean, we know the story, right? The population of the United States is increasing. Settlers are coming in. More and more conflicts with the various Native American tribes. And gold is discovered. One sure way of destroying a Native American tribe is to find gold on their property. And so you could not stop the settlers. Andrew Jackson knew that, and the individual states were the politics of Georgia and the other states are basically, we don't care about the Native Americans. That's our land. We're going to take it. And that's pretty much how it worked out. There's a famous Supreme Court case in which the Cherokee Nation sued the state of Georgia, saying that they cannot take our lands. And John Marshall sided with the Cherokee, said, you are right. They cannot interfere in your tribal government and your land. It did not matter. They were going to be kicked out anyway. And there's a statement, there's a story that Andrew Jackson made this callous remark about that ruling. John Marshall made his ruling, let him enforce it. That probably was not something that Andrew Jackson said, but it may as well have been. Andrew Jackson, along with most people in the United States, were ready to get rid of the Native Americans, send them across the Mississippi River into Oklahoma, and that's how it worked out. Congress passes various Indian removal acts, and it's set in motion. We are getting rid of the Native Americans. That's going to be our territory. And as we know, thousands died in the transporting across. And of course, it wasn't just the Cherokee. It was, you have the Creek, the Chickasaw, Seminole, Choctaw, from various parts of the Southeast, removed from their tribal lands and sent across the Mississippi, mostly into Oklahoma. And the other great battle that Andrew Jackson fought that was singularly a battle that he fought and he wanted to win more than any other. He had this hatred for the monopoly, the central bank, that, and this is the second bank of the United States, that he came in on as president, never liking bankers in general, but not liking the central bank in particular. Now, at first, he was willing to compromise. He wanted some oversight to this bank so that it didn't have the power to control our economy as it did. Now, Nicholas Biddle, who was the president of the bank, was a very talented, very capable president, and by and large managed the bank very well, and our country prospered by that. However, before Nicholas Biddle was president, you had some others who were not so talented, not so intelligent, and not so honest. 1819, there was a big crash in the United States, partially because of the incompetence of the president of the bank. Now, Nicholas Biddle, as I say, was talented, generally speaking, an honest man who wanted the best for the bank and the country. But he wielded power that was well beyond something that one single man should have. And that's what Jackson was opposed to. He wanted legislation that would limit the power of the bank, that would help regulate and have some oversight into this bank. Because Nicholas Biddle is not going to be there forever. If you got some very evil, corrupt, greedy president in that office, he could tank the American economy with no trouble at all. So anyway, 20% of the loans, 1/3 of America's specie, and Jackson worked at first rather slowly, cautiously, trying to get a feel for what he could and couldn't do as far as regulating the bank. And eventually, Nicholas Biddle, for all of his talents, made the fatal decision to go up against Andrew Jackson and fight him head to head. And so, during the 1832, the presidential election year, Andrew Jackson's up for re-election. Nicholas Biddle knows that there's a lot of power and popularity for his bank. So he says, look, why don't we recharter the bank now, ahead of time? There's no way that the country is going to go against me. The Congress is in favor of the bank. They will vote for the recharter. And Andrew Jackson probably won't have the guts to veto it, but if he does, it doesn't matter, because my bank is so popular that Congress will override his veto. Well, it didn't work out that way. Congress did recharter the bank. Andrew Jackson vetoed it, and by that time he had a campaign going against the bank, and he had his supporters in Congress putting out the message: the bank is too powerful. It's a monopoly. It's for the rich against the poor. And that was the theme during this time that Andrew Jackson presented to the American people, and it worked by and large. And foreign influence, that's another one. You talk about how the bank has so much money owned by foreign interests that they even control some of the funds that are in our nation, in the bank. And a lot of people get riled up about foreigners too. So, Congress could not override the veto. Jackson wins re-election, but oddly enough, and I read this and I thought, well, this is kind of surprising. He won by a slimmer majority than he had the first time out. And this is the only time in American history that a president was re-elected with a smaller majority than when he was first elected. The bank fight hurt his image, because there were an awful lot of people who really supported the bank and felt that it was a good thing for our country. And as I said, it was doing a pretty good job at the time. And so Nicholas Biddle, well, Jackson says, okay, now I'm going to dismantle this bank. I'm going to order that U.S. funds are removed from this bank and curtail some of its other operations. Nicholas Biddle said, well, you want to fight? I'll give you a fight. I'm going to stop all loans from our bank. And the economy tanked. He had that power. Now, it made him look bad, and it didn't last very long because he realized that he was on the losing end of that battle. But anyway, he demonstrated to Jackson and the American people he had power. So the National Republicans, who were what was left of the original political party that everybody split off from, and others get together and say, well, we need a new political party now. We will have the Whig Party, a name derived from Great Britain. They had their Whigs there. And by 1836, the bank, the recharter did not happen, and so the bank was dead. So, in his last years in office, he got to choose 6 Supreme Court judges, including Roger B. Taney, and I think I spelled his name wrong. How many of you know who Roger B. Taney is? Okay, so when you see a picture of Abraham Lincoln being sworn in, and that withered old man who is the Supreme Court judge who's swearing him in, that's Roger B. Taney. And he was also on a very important case involving slavery, but we'll get into that later. So he paid off, so one of the great things Andrew Jackson did, paid off the national debt. Do you believe that? The last time in our history we had no debt. 1834, everything was paid off. He offered to buy Texas from Mexico. He knew that lots of Americans were coming out there, and he really thought that Mexico might take the bait, but they did not. But on his second to last day in office, after Texas had fought Mexico and won, he decided that he can now recognize Texas as an independent country, and he did that. And here is the old Andrew Jackson. Still, we have photography, as I said, but he was not president at this time. This was some years afterwards. Old man suffered terribly in his last several years of his life. Various ailments. I didn't talk about all the duels and fights that he was in his younger years, but he had a certain amount of lead carried around in his body from the duels, very famous, and just the hard life that he had led. He suffered terribly in various joints and parts of his body, and there he is in his last years. And then we have this marvelous statue. We all know where this is, right? Lafayette Square, Washington, D.C. Almost torn down during the last disturbances that we've had, but yeah, marvelous statue. Any questions? Yes?
I know in Europe, if someone's on a horse that both legs are raised, it means they died in battle. But he didn't die in battle.
No, he did not. No. Yeah, that's not an American tradition. So, yeah. Anything else? Yes?
Where did our measurement system come from?
England. Basically, we inherited that confused and very tangled and senseless system from the Middle Ages. Yeah. So when you think about inches, feet, miles, pounds, ounces, all that. Just think of how awful the Middle Ages were, because that's representative of that. So.
Symbolic, right?
Yeah, very much so. Okay, so again, I will not be here next week, so I'll make sure that that is known. But take care.